Hi. So the scientific method is a procedure used to, or steps used to solve scientific problems and collect data and observations. So moving right along, first, in order to start these steps, you have to actually have a problem that you want to solve. So we use these steps to solve different problems. When we have a problem in science, the best way to phrase it to help us find all the pieces that we need is in a question. We have to ask something. And the best way to ask is to put it in a does this affect this formula. So, does blank affect blank? So, I could say, does the amount of sun my tomato plant get affect how many tomatoes it will produce? Or I could say, does smoking cigarettes daily affect my risk of getting lung cancer? Okay, so see how we can word questions in that format in order to research them. Does doing your homework daily affect your grades? You probably right away when you heard those questions want to answer it, but not quite yet. We're going to look at a few more examples. Does the amount of gum affect the size of the bubble? Does the soap you use affect the cleanliness of your dishes? And there's my one. Does the sunlight, the amount of sunlight, affect the height of your tomato plant? So all of these are worded in that correct format. Does something affect something else? Does the speed at which you drive your car affect how many tickets you get? The hypothesis. So right away, you probably wanted to answer all of those questions with, yeah, this affects this, or I think this. Right. So that's your hypothesis. That's the predicted answer that comes for the problem. And we always word that in a if-then statement. And it answers both parts of the question. So if the question says, does doing my homework daily affect my grades? The first part, if, addresses the does doing homework. If I do my homework every day, then my grades will increase the most. So that part, the then, deals with the second half of the question. So the hypothesis addresses both parts of the question. So let's take a look at some of our examples. Our problems, let's review them. Does the amount of gum? Does the type of soap? Does the amount of sunlight? So our hypothesis, the first part should address those parts, and our then should address the effect part. So let's take a look. Does the amount? Well, if I chew 4 pieces of gum, then how does my bubble look? My bubble will be the biggest. Does the type of soap? Yes, if I use Dawn soap, then how clean will my dishes get? Then my dishes will be the cleanest. And finally, we talked about the tomato plant. Does the tomato plant, does the amount of sun affect its height? So if I give that tomato plant 5 hours of sun, I'm answering the amount of sun, then how's its height look? It will be the tallest. Notice the second part of my hypothesis always has an est word. Most, greatest, tallest, fastest. We could go back to some of the other examples I gave. Does the speed of my car affect how many tickets I get? Well, if I drive 20 miles over the speed limit, then I will get the most tickets, right? Okay. Next up. The next part is while we're doing our experiment to test our hypothesis, because we don't know if our hypothesis answer is correct. It's a guess. It's an educated guess. We've done research. We think it's the correct answer, but we're not sure. So we have to do an experiment. In our experiment, we need two variables. We need the independent variable and we need the dependent variable. So the independent, I always say I. The independent is the one I can change or manipulate or control as the scientist. So for instance, we talked about our experiment with, our first experiment was about the gum. Does the amount of gum? Well, as a scientist, the one thing in that question that I can change is how much gum I give you. I can't look at you and say, make a bubble 6 inches wide, but I can say, hey, you, I'm going to give you 4 pieces of gum, or I'm going to give you 6 pieces of gum, or maybe I give you 1 piece of gum. Same thing here in the second one. Does the type of soap affect the cleanliness of my dishes? Well, the only thing I can give you or change is the type of soap. I can't make the dishes any cleaner just by looking at them. So I, the scientist, can tell you what type of soap to use. And finally, you guessed it in the last one. What part can I control? I can control how much sunlight I let the tomato plants have. I can control the sunlight. So that is the independent variable, the one that I have a say in. So let's look at our examples. The amount of gum, the brand of soap, and the amount of sun. Gum, amount of sun, and gum. It's the one that comes after the word does in the problem. If you noticed, each of those does, and then followed by amount of gum, does, type of soap, does, amount of sun. Those are the independent variables. They come right after the word does in the problem. The next variable is the dependent because it depends on what the independent is. It goes up and down, not because of me, but because of that independent variable. So let's take a look at our examples again. If my problem has already addressed the independent and we said, here's the independent variable, well, guess what? The only other part of the experiment left is the size of the bubble. So that must be our dependent variable. It depends on how much gum Miss Watts gives me. So dependent, size of bubble. You guessed it here too. I've already highlighted the one we chose for independent, type of soap. That leaves the cleanliness of my dishes to be the dependent. Cleanliness depends on what type of soap you get. And finally, the same trick. There's my independent. That means the last thing I have in this one is the height of the tomato plant. And if you haven't guessed by now, if the independent comes after the word does, the dependent comes after the word affect. It's what is affected by the independent. Okay? So if we look at our slide, there is size of bubble, cleanliness of dishes, and height of plants. It's everything that comes after the word affect because we said it's what is affected by the independent variable. So for one more final example, if I said, does the speed of my car affect how many tickets I get? Our independent is, you guessed it, that would be the speed of my car. And that makes the dependent how many tickets I get. Correct. One final part. If we're testing the independent variable, we want to see, does the amount of gum matter? Is it the amount of gum? Well, then I have to keep everything else in my experiment the same so that I'm guaranteed that the only thing that is changing and that I'm manipulating is that amount of gum. So it wouldn't be fair if I gave one person cherry gum and one person spearmint. And maybe I gave one person Hubba Bubba and one person Stride. And then I gave one person, maybe I let them chew for 5 minutes and then blow their bubble. And the only other person got 2 minutes and had to blow a bubble. None of those situations would be fair because then I don't know what I'm testing at all. Is it that I gave a person 4 pieces and one person 2? Or is it the flavor? Or am I testing the time? Am I testing the brand? What is it that I'm testing? So if I'm testing amount of gum, then everything else, the flavor, the brand, the time chewed before the bubble, those things have to stay constant for the experiment to be valid and for my data to truly reflect that it was the number of pieces of gum the person had that affected the size of the bubble. So these things are called constants. In our examples, we said for the gum example, the brand of gum, the person chewing, the number of chews before the bubble, all of those things except pieces would have to stay constant. For our dish soap, for example, you could use the amount of soap because we were testing the brand. So the amount of each brand would have to be the same. The cycle on the dishwasher would have to be the same. Temperature of water, the time that we washed the dishes. So all of those things would have to stay the same. So I'm only testing the different brands. So for our experiment where I'm driving my car and I want to know, does speed affect how many tickets I get? What of these multiple choice answers would be considered my constants? And finally, in conclusion, we have to say whether or not our answer, our hypothesis, was right or wrong. So if I said 4 pieces of gum would make the largest bubble, did my data prove that to be true? Or was it 6 pieces of gum that made the biggest bubble? So my conclusion is going to summarize what my data that I collected showed and tell, finally, whether my hypothesis was right or wrong. And that would be my last statement. Is my hypothesis right or wrong?